Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. We have with us once again Steve Bancarz, back for another interview. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we have a lot of things to talk about,
We do.
as always, but what we want to zero in on for this episode is Christ consciousness. Now, this is, again, something real common to the New Age community, but I mean, when I hear that, when other people hear that, we probably would get hopelessly imprecise about defining what in the world that is and be all over the board. So why don't you tell us what that is? I mean, when New Agers use that term,
Right.
what are they thinking?
What they're thinking is that Christ consciousness, it's a reference to a divine state of mind, to embody the consciousness, the state of mind, the state of awareness that Jesus had. And the idea is that Jesus realized that he was God, that he was the Word made flesh, just as we all are. So it's premised on this idea, this pantheistic idea, that man is divine by nature, that man is God by nature. And so the one who has Christ consciousness is the one who realizes and embodies the realization that he is ultimately divine by nature, that he is intrinsically divine. Right?
So this isn't an altered state, but it sounds like a little more than Jesus is a model.
Right.
It goes a little bit beyond that.
It does. He wasn't just a model. He embodied a certain spirit, a certain mindset that is really universal. They would say people before him embodied Christ consciousness as well. And anybody can embody Christ consciousness insofar as they discover that dimension of their being, that realm of their being that exists beyond the ego, beyond the personal self, in what you can call the realm of pure consciousness or the realm of pure awareness, where you become one with God. You know, as Jesus says, I and the Father are one. The belief is that God is the very substance and being of man. So God is an impersonal force in the universe, the very substance of reality itself. It's very monistic. And then the one who can proclaim about themselves, I embody Christ consciousness, is the one who realizes and lives from the state of their own intrinsic divinity. So this is really rooted in an Eastern mystical concept of God.
I have two questions. What does it mean to live within intrinsic divinity? Like in a practical, your alarm goes off, you get out of bed. Like what is that?
Right. So the alarm goes off, you get out of bed, and normally people go into the ordinary stream of thinking. They're identified with the ego mind, with the animal nature, if you will. The personal sense.
I want breakfast, is that the animal nature?
That is.
Okay.
It's a personal sense of I.
Yeah.
So anything that emanates out of this personal sense of identity is just a mask that God consciousness is wearing, the universe is wearing. God, this force, is wearing for a temporary period of time. And so the idea is you want to disidentify from your personal sense of self through practices like meditation and mindfulness. These cultivate Christ consciousness within an individual.
It sounds like you're just reminding yourself of this thought that I'm divine.
Yeah, it's a little more than
like
reminding yourself.
But so you're not talking yourself into it.
No, it's not. It's not adding new content to your mind. It's a shift in consciousness. It's a shift to a deeper, more fundamental level of awareness.
I'm still wondering, how would I know if I ran into someone that was committed to this? What is different about them?
Well, you would probably hear them speak, and they would have some kind of wisdom in the context of Eastern mysticism or new spirituality, new thought. Generally speaking, their behavior would be Christ-like in terms of being loving, compassionate, being able to reconcile with people in disputes and so forth, kind of exhibiting what the Bible would call the fruits of the Spirit, but without actually having the Spirit. And so it's not a matter of adding new content to your mind in the New Age movement. To embody Christ consciousness requires a shift from consciousness from the personal self, from the thinker, from the thought stream.
From self-interest to something else. Can we boil it down to something like that simplistic, or?
No. So basically, we would want to preface this on, and this is just to give context too. This is not a niche topic, right? This is something you can pick up any one of Deepak Chopra's books. There's going to be something about this in there. Same with Eckhart Tolle, whether it's The Power of Now or A New Earth. Oprah Winfrey is someone who believes this very vehemently, that God is the all, that all is God, And Jesus is someone who embodied that and lived from that state of realization, from that self-discovery. So it's not so much you're thinking about something else, it's about you've discovered something about yourself, and then you live from that state of self-awareness that you intrinsically embody the being and substance of God.
What's the difference between that and a Gnostic awakening? Is Gnosticism more theological, if I can use that term?
Yeah, I would say so. Gnosticism would be a little bit more even intellectual and gnosis based, where this doesn't have to do with any special or secret or esoteric information or content. It has to do with really the opposite in theory. The absence of content. Beneath content itself is a realm of awareness. And those who access this realm of awareness can be said to be unified with God, because God, I should have defined this a little earlier, God is the substance of reality insofar as the substance of reality is consciousness, and God is consciousness. So that's what they would say. They would believe consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, and that beneath the personal sense of self, there's a more fundamental level of awareness that Jesus lived from.
So if I was just sitting with somebody I didn't know that was committed to this worldview, and I heard them say that, I would ask them a question like, well, do you believe a dog has consciousness?
Yes, they would definitely
and
believe the dog has
so the dog
consciousness.
is God as well?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Right, so everybody is God, whether they recognize that they're God or not, right? Jesus is someone who recognized it, who discovered it.
How does a dog recognize that it's God?
Well,
in other words, if it can't, I'm wondering how much God it really is, because it would seem like along with being, this kind of consciousness, being God, again defined as consciousness here, it just feels like there ought to be some faculty in a person that can actually recognize that, or what good is it?
In order to say that they had Christ consciousness, they would need to have first-person mental states.
Okay.
Absolutely, and the dog doesn't. But they would say that because this is really pantheistic at its core, or panentheistic
really
even in some
matter.
cases, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
A dog is God just as much as this pillow is God. This pillow is literally just as much as God as I would be in this world.
Even though it has no consciousness.
Even though it has no consciousness. But for it, in order to say that a being exhibits God consciousness or Christ consciousness, they have to have an awareness, an intellectual awareness, but also cultivate that in their life and live from that state of realizing that they're ultimately unified with the divine. And once again, Jim Carrey, Russell Brand, Oprah Winfrey, even a 2020 presidential candidate, Marianne Williamson, believes this doctrine wholeheartedly. It's very, very, very prevalent in the West right now. It's a staple doctrine, the New Age movement, bestsellers, tens of millions of copies. Neil Donald Walsh has a series called Conversations with God. And there's
is an ISIS terrorist God?
Absolutely.
He hasn't realized it.
Right. So he doesn't exhibit Christ consciousness, but he's God by nature. Everything and everyone is God by nature. Those who exhibit that and understand that and then exhibit it are those who can be said to have Christ consciousness.
So I would imagine that when someone is trying very hard, to exhibit this, and they do something cruel to someone else, then that's like a spasm of not exhibiting this.
That's right. That would be.
They wouldn't call it sin, or maybe even they wouldn't call it evil. It would be, again, falling short.
Well, they would say it would be a symptom of self-ignorance.
Okay.
Right, and they wouldn't want to use the word trying, because effort implies distinction and separation. Right. So if I'm trying, that means I'm working toward something I'm not. So if someone's trying, they really don't exhibit Christ consciousness, because Christ consciousness can only be known in rest, when the ego is basically either not suppressed but dissolved by this greater understanding and this greater awareness.
Right. Well, to me, a conscious being, I don't know how you eliminate effort.
Right.
From what you just described.
Right.
You can pretend that you're not trying, but again,
I know.
In like real life, you have to make decisions. I'm going to do A instead of B.
That's
I'm
right.
not going to do A. I'm going to do.
That's right.
I mean, you still have to do that.
That's right. So they would say that there is an aspect of the ego, of the individual self, that is needed to function and to operate in the world, and Jesus would have used the ego as well. But there's a difference between utilizing the ego when it's necessary and living as the ego and thinking that you are the ego, that you are, and they would define the ego as being the part of your identity that is wrapped up in concept or in social status or in history.
Okay, you just mentioned, you used a phrase, high social status, okay? So with some of the individuals you mentioned, they have high social status, they have a high degree of popularity. So I would assume, again, as the lay person here, I would assume that as they're being absorbed by, or mind melding, or however we want to talk about it, with this consciousness, trying to reimagine themselves as this, are they really willing to surrender their high status? I mean, to me, that would seem to be very difficult. If you're at a certain level of popularity, do we see evidence in their lives that they sort of, like Jesus would? I mean, Jesus, I think it's fair to say, was someone who didn't intentionally try to make himself of some reputation to vaunt himself over others, and that just seems to be an entrapping thing in pop culture, because a lot of these people, again, you mentioned, that they're part of that world, and who they are is sort of defined, by people kowtowing to them. So do you see in people like this a real trajectory moving away from that? In other words, how real is this in their lives?
Right. For people who really kind of practice what they preach, I don't really think I've seen anybody in the West in the New Age movement really practice what they preach. It comes more from people over in the East. I'm thinking like Osho would have been someone who practiced what he preached. Ram Dass.
I mean, this takes a lot of surrender.
It's
a lot of things.
It requires a lifestyle and a life commitment. Someone like Mooji would be another one, and their life is about teaching this to other people. They think they found the greatest truth ever, that all of suffering is wrapped up in self-ignorance of your own divinity, and that this divinity can be lived from and embodied as a realm of pure consciousness that is beyond the personal self. And they're trying to
see that actually sounds a little selfish, because maybe I can take care of my suffering if I come to this realization, but how do I take care of your suffering?
Right.
Because ultimately, for you to conquer suffering, you have to come to the same realization. So I mean, I could preach to you all day long about how you need to have Christ consciousness, but is that really relieving your burden in real time?
Right. Yeah. So a person who's spending 4 or 5 hours a day meditating in a cave somewhere in a mountainside.
Right. How practical is that for someone else?
Nobody even knows they exist, let alone that they have Christ consciousness. It doesn't mean anything to everybody who exists that there's a man in a cave somewhere doing something that nobody cares
Somebody
about.
who's living in the next cave down the road who is suffering isn't impacted in any way.
Right, but the New Age will try and rescue that, right? And the New Age will say that, well, by you focusing on your own enlightenment and cultivating consciousness, cultivating presence, as it's called, they'll call it presence with a capital P. By cultivating presence, you are raising the vibration of the planet, insofar as vibration refers to, in a loose general sense, your energetic field. The way your energetic field resonates out into the world changes as you begin to embody higher states of consciousness. And so while you're not directly helping...
You're making me cynical right now.
Right.
I'm sitting here thinking, well, that sounds like a really, really good way to excuse myself from not doing anything practical. I'm changing the world's vibration or something like this.
Right. Well, they would definitely say service to others should be part of one's regimen. But as far as that area of one's regimen that is mostly just self-centered, they would say that has indirect benefits, and then they'll draw from studies, people who, New Age teachers anyways, will draw from studies like the Maharishi Institute or the Institute of Noetic Sciences with Dean Radin that demonstrate or seem to demonstrate a correlation between between consciousness, a person's consciousness and the mood of another person, depending on what they're kind of projecting or emanating in their thoughts and in their energy toward that individual. Things even like there's been some studies that have come out involving people who are group meditation, and a correlation to natural disasters and social disasters and crime rates. So they're trying to say when people decide, they come together thousands at a time to meditate, crime rates in that city go down. And they'll say, that's proof that changing the world starts with you and all this
Right.
poetic stuff. There's other explanations for that. Correlation doesn't
Sure,
imply
yeah.
causation,
Right.
obviously. But they will try and rescue this idea of, futility with,
Mm-hmm.
you're raising the consciousness of the
One
planet.
last question. Do you see this creeping into the church at all? In other words, is there some degree of mix? Because, you're tuned into this. Okay, you have a lot of life experience in this stuff. You have a lot of, research experience in this stuff. So when you look at, let's just make a sweeping generalization here, the modern evangelical church, do you see this in there somewhere? And how would you, if you do, what's your advice to the believing Christian community?
Yeah, well, the advice would be, first and foremost, recognize that this is terribly unbiblical,
Mm-hmm.
right? Not only does the Bible say that we are ontologically separated
Sure.
from God by nature, put fear in them, O Lord, let the nations know they are but men. Or a big one from, I think it's Exodus 31, the Egyptians are man and not God, their horses are flesh and not spirit.
Yeah.
And that's black and white. Their horses are not spirit, they're flesh. The king of Tyre in Ezekiel 28, or Babylon, Isaiah 14, King Herod, and Acts 12, everyone who tried to wear deity for themselves was issued the death penalty by God directly. So if God really wanted us believing that we're divine by nature, he would set a biblical precedent, then capital punishment for us in Scripture. Or there's the Antichrist, whose precedent's hellfire. That's the only other guy. So maybe Nebuchadnezzar as well, who got turned over to be a reprobate mind, was made to eat grass. And it's like, so God really does not agree with this idea.
He doesn't take it lightly.
No, and of course there's also, we're separated from God relationally through sin. But here's a proof text that I like when, so this is important for Christians to know. This is like a knockdown argument. There's two of them. I'd like to cover them real quick. One of them would be, the Pharisees approach John the Baptist and they say, are you the Christ? He says, I'm not the Christ. But this is someone whom Jesus said was the greatest man ever. Truly I say to you, there has been none greater than John the Baptist. So the greatest man who ever lived was not Christ, but Deepak Chopra's Christ. But you're Christ, but I'm Christ.
Right.
And they'll literally say, I am Christ in the New Age movement. Neil Donald Walsh, not just Jesus has been Christed and can be Christed, you can be Christed too. Is the Course in Miracles, is Jesus the Christ? Oh yes, along with you. You're Christ too, you just don't realize it yet, like Jesus of Nazareth did. He embodied that divine state of mind called Christ. It's a noun that refers to a state of consciousness. And in my opinion, a smoking gun for this being terribly unbiblical and even dangerous would be Matthew 24, starting in verse 3. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus says, in the last days, many will come and say, I am Christ, and will deceive many. He doesn't say many will come and say, I am Jesus. There's only been about, a dozen to 24 people who really had any kind of mark in history who claimed to be Jesus incarnate. And they all had, for the most part, relatively small cult followings that have all dissolved with time, right? So is he referring to these small cult followings and those claiming to be Jesus, or is he referring to those like the founder of the most popular New Age YouTube channel and website online right now, reaching millions and millions a month, looking me in the face on Skype and saying, I am Christ, and leading many astray? Deepak Chopra, Eckhart Tolle, Oprah Winfrey, I am Christ, we are all Christ. Is Jesus hitting at people claiming to be Jesus himself, or is he hitting at this idea that there's going to be a resurrection of the Edenic lie of man's intrinsic deity, where people claim to be Christ, anointed in their divinity just like Jesus was? So I think, far from being biblical, it could actually tie into end times prophecy in some way without being sensationalist. I think you can definitely rule it out by virtue of Matthew 24. Now, do I see this leaking into the church in any way? I do see a lot of people willing to embrace the idea that they're divine by nature, or that there's some kind of metaphysical energy within physical things, which is actually about 25% of the professing church believes that there's spiritual energy in physical things, which is a close call to monism. It's a close call to pantheism. There aren't any studies done with any kind of statistics about how many believe in this version of Christ consciousness. My guesstimation would be maybe a third, 30%, 33%, when you consider other staggering statistics, like about 30% believe in reincarnation, for example. And when you consider a lot of professing Christians are involved and have been involved in the New Age ministry of Oprah Winfrey, which is responsible for a lot of this spreading into the Christian church, because she teaches this stuff explicitly more than anybody else in history, literally, since the 80s, as one of the most influential women in history, all while professing to be a Christian. So a lot of this really can be accredited back to her, but I don't really see it leaking into church theology. I mean, Mormonism has some, with the exaltation of man doctrine, that loosely you could correlate and make a stretch to that.
But Oprah sounds, like, well, she's had, Eckhart Tolle on there, so many times. Yeah.
And Marianne Williamson. Yeah. Every New Age kingpin has been promoted and advertised by her since the early 90s. Actually, the late 80s. I have a video on my YouTube channel debunking Oprah's theology, where she is pushing, you can hear her verbatim, say that I'm a Christian in one sentence. The very next sentence, I don't believe Jesus came to die for our sins. He came to show us the Christ consciousness that he had, and that Christ consciousness abides with us all.
Yeah.
And she's saying this in the context of this Eastern mystical backdrop that we just defined earlier in the episode. So it's extremely prevalent, and it's working its way into the thought life of Christians because it's so pervasive in the West right now, but you don't really see it in any kind of systematic theology of any denomination or anything like that, though you could make some kind of loose correlation between this version of man's deity and embodying the deity that Christ embodied with the kenosis version of Jesus that's kind of taught in the NAR, where we can kind of, the idea is that he left his deity at the doorstep when he incarnated, and everything he did in controlling the forces of nature, and saying to, I believe it was Nathaniel, I saw you under the fig tree, that we can all do these things too, as men, in right relationship with God. We can embody the mentality, the state of mind, the state of being that Christ had, because everything he did, he didn't do as God. Peace be still. He didn't do that as God.
Yeah.
He did that as man in right relationship to God, and therefore we need to try and work to cultivate that same relationship with the Father that he had, because his miracles weren't coming from his divine nature, but from what he cultivated in his humanity.
Right. Well, those are good examples. And I would agree. The average person in church isn't going to even know what kenotic or kenosis is. But so I think your earlier concerns expressed in the wider pop culture with people calling themselves Christians, and then they do this over on the other hand. They say these things, and so again, for the average Christian, it is possible that they can conflate those things and not even really know.
That's right.
What it is they're doing. So, yeah, this is good. I think this is a good exposure, this topic. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you. It's been good. Thanks
for watching Fringe Pop 321. Please visit our website. For all of our episodes, we have companion web pages. For our interviews, you can get more source material as well by searching through the site. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if you want to support what we're doing here at Fringe Pop, go to fp321.com/S, as in the letter S. And thanks for watching, because what you know may not be so.